How did the current boundary between Uganda and Kenya come about? Who was responsible for deciding this, and under what circumstances? We shall seek the answers to these questions in this episode. The story begins in 1889, when the British and the Germans were racing to see who between the two would get to Uganda first. It's a complex story, but the outcome was that Frederick Lugard, on behalf of the British company active in the region, which was called the IBEA, signed a treaty with Kabaka Mwanga on December 26, 1890, which defined the geographical limits of the covered territory. The definition in the treaty was very simple. It simply said, in quotes, Kingdom of Buganda and all tributary states, close quotes. So the geographical limits as defined there were very vague. The treaty itself is interesting. We see on the side of the IBEA the signature of a remarkable Somali called Duala Idris, about whom we shall come back in a future episode. We also see on the last page the signatures of the high-ranking officials in Buganda, like the Katikiro. After that, the company tried to establish presence in what is now Uganda, but in this they failed, and within a few months, discussions began on how to leave Uganda altogether and remain near the coast, that is between Mombasa and Uganda. To study the situation and advise on the best course of action, a British Foreign Office official was sent to Buganda in 1893. His recommendation was that the imperial government in London should take over the entire territory. It said, his recommendation stated, in quotes, include the whole sphere in Zanzibar Protectorate and should take over the treaties made by the company with the different tribes all over the sphere, close quotes. So this recommendation from him did not specify the area that was covered in the recommendation. He raised the Union Jack in March 1893, and from that day on, Buganda officially became a British protectorate. Before leaving Buganda in May, he signed a new treaty with Kabaka Mwanga, which defined the treaty again, and it said the treaty covered the territory known as, in quotes, the Kingdom of Uganda and its dependencies, close quotes. At no time during that period did Mwanga's power extend anywhere beyond Busoga towards the east. In other communication, the same commissioner recommended that the eastern boundaries of Uganda should be, open quotes, neighboring countries as far as the eastern border of Kavirondo, close quotes. It is important to note that during all this time, the focus of the European powers was Buganda, and not the region in what we now call Kenya. When you look at the communication by the British Foreign Office officials during this period, the region between Buganda and the coast is simply referred to in a very general way, and there is no effort even to give it a name. In one of the documents, as an example, they described it as this way. The country lying between Lake Victoria and the east coast is valuable chiefly as being the road to Uganda, close quotes. When the new treaty was published in the London Gazette on June 18, 1894, it was stated that this protectorate comprises the territory known as Uganda proper and bounded by the territories known as Usoga, Unyoro, Ankoli, and the Rakai district, close quotes. Meanwhile, the IBEA company lived on for a short while after leaving Uganda. And during that period, after leaving Uganda, their farthest station inland was at Dagoretti, which is near Nairobi today. On September 8, 1894, the IBEA were told by the Foreign Office that Uganda's eastern boundary was being extended just beyond Naivasha. So at that time, the British Foreign Office who had taken over Uganda, and they were telling the company that they are extending their eastern boundary just beyond Naivasha. This was the basis upon which Idi Amin would claim in 1976 that the region between Busia and Lake Naivasha belonged to Uganda. As we can see in this map here, it's a sketch map from the British Foreign Office showing the extent of Uganda's eastern boundary. And as we can see, it runs from near Lake Bagadi all the way up north, and it goes around Lake Naivasha. Between 1894 and 1902, because both colonies were under the same European power, that is Buganda and British East Africa, or what is now Kenya, there was no urgency to demarcate the boundary, and so it remained undefined on the ground. The need to define the boundary would be driven by other factors. So between those 2 years, 1894 and 1902, the line that we see here, the yellow line, was the only definition between the two protectorates. But this line had not been demarcated on the ground. In July 1895, the IBEA company collapsed for good, and the region between Uganda and the coast was also taken over by the British Foreign Office. On July 15, 1895, the London Gazette defined the western extent of this region, which is now Kenya, as that, in quotes, lying between the protectorate of Uganda and the coast, and between the river Juba and the northern frontier of the German sphere, close quotes. In 1889, yet another special commissioner called Harry Johnston was sent to look into other problems in Uganda and recommend on the best solution for them. The key recommendation he gave in February 1900 was the union of both Uganda and what is now Kenya into a single colony or single protectorate with headquarters at Londiani. This was selected because of the climate and the central location. So the recommendation from Harry Johnston was to do away with the border entirely. This recommendation, however, was not received warmly, and instead, an idea that had been floating around in the Foreign Office to move Uganda's eastern boundaries westwards gained traction. In November 1901, the Foreign Secretary made it official, and he said, in quotes, "The moving of the frontier is definitely decided, and they should arrange their estimates accordingly," close quotes. What he meant there is that the colonial governments locally, in what is now Kenya and what is now Uganda, should know that the boundary was being adjusted, and they should arrange their future estimates accordingly. Charles Eliot and Frederick Jackson, Charles Eliot was from what is now Kenya, Frederick Jackson was from what is now Uganda, met at Joro and agreed on the rough outline of the new boundary. This was modified by the sub-commissioner for Uganda's Eastern Province, who was called Charles Hobley, who recommended that the new line should follow geographical features for part of the way and to follow language and ethnic boundaries the rest of the way. As we see here in the initial sketch by Hobley, the proposed boundary line ran from Lake Victoria all the way to the peak of Mount Elgon, and from there it was supposed to run along the Takwa River. Frederick Jackson, from the Uganda side, thought that Mount Elgon should be left entirely in Uganda. And after much discussion, the Foreign Office decided to leave the northern section undefined for the time being. Frederick Jackson thought that Mount Elgon should be left entirely in Uganda. And after much discussion, the Foreign Office decided to leave the northern section undefined for the time being. Clement Hill, who was another high-ranking official in the British Foreign Office, wanted the new province, the province being moved from Uganda, to be called the Lake Province. But Commissioner Eliot from Nairobi proposed it to be split in two and named the two resulting provinces Naivasha and Kisumu. He considered the original one too large for effective administration by a single sub-commissioner. The transfer itself was officially announced in an order dated March 5, 1902, and the European staff stationed there were transferred along with the province. After the transfer was officially complete, Charles Hobley from the Uganda side and William Grant from the British East Africa side, or what is now Kenya, were appointed to draw up a boundary line between the two protectorates. So what had happened previously was simply the decision being made that the boundary would be moved. So these two gentlemen were in charge of drawing up the line on the ground. Because the two evidently got along well, it is perhaps not a surprise that the line they proposed was along the same lines as Hobley's proposal from the previous year, and they submitted the report on July 25, 1902. It is instructive to note that the two boundary commissioners decided to limit their work between Lake Victoria and the Mount Elgon, or the headwaters of the River Takwel. The line of demarcation that they came up with began at the mouth of the Nzoia River and wound its way diagonally across Mount Elgon until contact was made with the Suam River, which is a tributary of the Takwel River. The other important point is that the distribution of different ethnic groups between the lake and Mount Elgon was one of the key considerations guiding them in the task. And this is evident in the instructions to them and also in their final report. The report was approved by the Foreign Office, despite objections from Charles Elliot, who thought that the boundary would present problems when the region was opened up for white settlers. Charles Elliot would become the key proponent of having European settlers in what is now Kenya. The line up to Mount Elgon has remained virtually unchanged, but it has gone through a few minor adjustments after that work by Charles Hobley and William Grant in 1902. Now to the section of the boundary north of Mount Elgon. In 1910, the governor of British East Africa told his counterpart in Uganda that his administration intended to establish civilian rule up to the Takwel River. He also wanted to know if Uganda had any plans for the region north of the Takwel River. So this is the region north of Lodwar. According to the governor from Nairobi, if Uganda had no plans for administering the area, they should either allow for the boundary to be adjusted, or they should allow for soldiers from what is now Kenya to have right of access in the course of their duties. So right of access across into what was then Uganda, beyond Lodwar, in the course of their patrol duties. Apparently, no answer was received, and this question would come up a number of times in subsequent years. The perception in Uganda at that time was that Turkana land was a wasteland from which no substantial revenue could be expected. For that reason, the government of Uganda was committed to simply paying for the company of soldiers, King's African Rifle soldiers, who were stationed north of Lodwar. In 1914, and after a military expedition, when the question came up again, the governor of Uganda agreed in principle to the frontier adjustment proposal in order to allow for better law enforcement. Perhaps due to the urgency of World War I, this was not followed up, however. But in 1919, when the war was over, the governors of Kenya and British East Africa held a conference about this. They agreed that the region north of the Takwel River would be provisionally administered by the East Africa Protectorate, meaning the British East Africa, or what is now Kenya, with assistance from soldiers from Uganda. In July of 1919, the new governor of British East Africa, who was called Edward Northey, proposed a permanent change to the boundary to reflect the recent decisions, and this was formally agreed to. Northey wanted the new boundary line announced in a new order in council that was being prepared about the cessions of Jubaland to Somalia. That, however, didn't happen, and so the boundary change was not included in the Jubaland order in council. In 1925, the authorities from the Kenyan colony gave notice that they intended to establish civilian rule in all Turkana land by the end of that year. As a follow-up, the region west of Lake Turkana and north of the Takwel River was officially and permanently transferred from Kenya to Uganda on February 1st, 1926. This change was made through an order in council dated April 7th, 1926. Since then, the boundary line between Uganda and Kenya has remained virtually unchanged. There have been a few minor adjustments One of them which is interesting and can be discussed in a future episode, but the rest of the line has remained the same. Thank you.